Spider-Man is a character deeply shaped by the theme of identity, and more specifically the process of transitioning from youth to adulthood provoked by regret. It's safe to say that this is one of the reasons why Spider-Man is often referred to as the most relatable superhero, because it's such an unflattering and honest depiction of maturity. And in the beginning of Spider-Verse, Peter Parker introduces himself, from his origins to his commercial prominence to his romantic quality as a figure looking over New York. Therefore, it highlights the packaging of this identity and what its values are, because each goofy product that Peter Parker references work both as a joke for the reality of the Spider-Man brand.
I'm a cereal, did a Christmas album, and a so-so popsicle.
It also highlights the process of identification. The terrible-looking popsicle is given value because of the recognizability of who it's trying to resemble. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is both a deconstruction and reconstruction of this process, because it both dismantles the workings of the themes of regret, guilt, and change, but then uses them to build a new character, and therefore reaffirming those old values, if that makes any sense.
A little bit of a gut, perhaps from dimensional warping.
Oh, yeah.
Better if I just had another chance to give you the bread that you deserve.
I just washed my hands. That's why they're wet. No other reason.
I mentioned this before in my old Spider-Man trilogy essay, but it's very easy to map out Spider-Man's identity into the self-concept theory, which is divided by three components: the ideal self, self-esteem, and self-image. And because Spider-Man stories tend to be coming-of-age tales, once you break down the character's arc, it's very easy to notice these mechanical pieces in the character's identity.
You're the best of all of us, Miles. You're on your way.
And since human identity is very much heavily reliant on the feedback from others, the supporting characters in the storytelling always works to reflect the different components of the self-concept. Uncle Aaron is representative of Miles' ideal self because it's how he wants to see himself, someone who is creatively free, smooth, and is rebellious in a sense of individualism.
Hey. You sure you my nephew, man?
While what's interesting about Miles' self-image is that he doesn't define himself with who he is, he only knows who he isn't. He doesn't want to go to private school nor live the exhausting life of disciplinary responsibility that his father has projected onto him.
I see this spark in you. It's amazing. It's why I push you, but it's yours.
Ironically, to try and prevent Miles from ending up like his uncle, but because Miles' self-esteem is completely dependent on his relationship with his Uncle Aaron, his self-image and his ideal self is actually quite close together. Miles is confident with who he is the moment the story begins, but at the same time his identity is only an impression that isn't wholly accurate or representative of what Miles is capable of.
Hey.
Okay.
Something that only his father can see. So there's an unconscious gap in Miles' identity. Therefore, in the same way that the crappy popsicle that appears in the beginning of the story, the events of being bitten by the radioactive spider, then having a moment of intense guilt from standing by and seeing Spider-Man being murdered, learning to swing for the first time, these familiar story beats that exist in themselves as expected contents of a Spider-Man story and product reshapes Miles' self-concept. In other words, Miles' life gets a new packaging that changes the values of his contents. All of a sudden, his self-esteem is torn to shreds because he's not spared by the consequences of the gap in his identity and the anxiety that it then creates.
Miles? Miles?
His new powers makes his prior ideal self completely irrelevant, and Miles' self-image is now trying its best to adapt and forge a new identity. But because he has no firm, sovereign, and independent grounds, any identity that is built is incredibly fragile, which is symbolically marked by the goofy, cheap Halloween costume he wears for a huge chunk of the story. Effectively, Miles substitutes one impression for another. He goes from following his image of his uncle, which turns out to be inaccurate, to following the image of Spider-Man, a figure he can't reach because the mask demands something that can't be imitated. It demands a form of inner manifestation, if you will. To make Miles feel even smaller, the scope gets bigger. through incorporating even more characters that, unlike him, are successful in mastering their identity. All of this is hammered by the deliberate, repetitious nature of the comic covers. Gwen, Noir Spider-Man, Penny, Spider-Ham, and even Peter B. Parker are all successful protagonists of their own stories.
I was bitten by a radioactive pig.
This draws a line between Miles and everyone else. He hasn't earned his comic cover because he hasn't even walked over that line yet. He hasn't crossed the threshold.
It's a leap of faith. That's all it is, Miles. A leap of faith.
Peter B. Parker's trashy appearance and life is representative of this notion that the Master isn't an idealized, flattering image, it's something deeper inside the individual's identity, something that can only be unlocked by crossing from the world division, between the borders of the self, separating the empty familiar and the emotional unknown. As Joseph Campbell said in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, freedom to pass back and forth across the world division, not contaminating the principles of the one with those of the other, yet permitting the mind to know the one by virtue of the other, is the talent of the Master. That was like the worst read I think I've ever freaking done, Jesus Christ. Miles Morales builds a new identity, not by creating new relationships, although that does help, but by forging a new relationship with himself. It takes the death of his Uncle Aaron and having the rest of the Spider-Verse gang, and even his father possibly leaving him, that forces Miles to look at himself past his impotence. Deep down inside Miles is a powerful impulse to take a leap, to build a new identity made truly tangible by its authenticity. Miles learns to be Spider-Man through someone who forgot how to be Spider-Man, and that's an incredibly important contrast because the success of Miles' transformation isn't from chasing an impression, but is from his own expression. This is an important distinction because it is all rooted from the development of a new competence. Miles discovers a new self-concept that is truly authentic because that leap is presented as being an action solely owned and motivated by Miles' choice. In other words, swinging acts thematically as an interface between Miles and his sense of honest and raw instinctual potential. It's iconically related to Spider-Man, of course, but it's presented to the audience to be an act personal to Miles, at foremost. He finally becomes the author of his own story and is able to effortlessly negotiate his individual identity with the life he previously was incredibly disinterested with. Because he doesn't pursue an image, he lives a life that isn't an imitation. Miles' self-esteem isn't moderated by his ideal self. Instead, it is his self-esteem that is moderated by his new self-image, all encapsulated by a mask he lives up to, by simply being himself in the most honest and capable way. I think this is what makes Spider-Verse so incredibly poignant. It shows us that the ideal self that we become isn't an identity that we inherit or even follow. It's something we create. And Miles Morales shows us that the exceptional individual isn't a figure outside that we look up to and strive towards. It's the byproduct of a pursuit deep inside us. We are who we are when we live brave lives, when we leave and take a leap.